Imagine a young man at the cusp of adulthood, standing between what he was and what he could become, driving a bright red car along an empty California highway, guided only by the fading glow of an August night. Imagine a journey that should have lasted mere hours, suddenly stretching into a labyrinth of inexplicable stops, strange detours, unanswered calls, and a final disappearance that carved itself into the landscape of American mystery. Bryce Laspisa did not vanish in chaos or violence. He vanished in motion, as if swallowed mid-journey by a darkness that left nothing but a wrecked car, pointing toward a destiny no one could trace. The story begins long before the crash site. It begins with the quiet unraveling of a life that had once seemed brilliantly aligned. Bryce, a college student in California, had returned to campus just days before the new semester. Those close to him described the days preceding his disappearance as subtly distorted, marked by shifts in behavior that suggested a mind drifting toward an unseen precipice. He gave away personal belongings that carried emotional weight, stayed awake through nights without reason, and moved through his routines with a disquiet that suggested he was already beginning to withdraw from the life he knew. The environment around him seemed unchanged. Classes preparing to restart, friends returning, routines resuming. Yet Bryce moved through it as though he sensed an undercurrent no one else perceived. His actions, though outwardly small, carried the gravity of someone quietly severing attachments. The days that followed revealed a pattern not of impulsivity, but of slow dissociation, as if something internal had shifted and begun to steer him away from familiar ground. What followed next was the beginning of a journey that defied explanation. Bryce left his apartment and began driving south, a direction that made sense only to him. His route did not follow logic or geography. It traced something else, something more elusive. Rather than traveling straight toward home or remaining in the safety of his college town, he drifted across highways in long, deliberate stretches, stopping at odd intervals, lingering in parking lots, idling on roadsides, as though waiting for something only he could sense. At each stop, the world around him remained unaware of the silent unraveling taking place behind the wheel. The traffic moved, the night deepened, the hours passed. But Bryce became increasingly distant from the patterns of ordinary life. The digital traces he left, phone pings, card receipts, vehicle sightings, formed a fragmented mosaic of a journey that made no rational sense. His car moved consistently, but without destination, as if propelled by internal gravity rather than by choice. Witnesses later confirmed seeing him alone, awake, calm, sitting behind the wheel of his red Toyota like someone rehearsing a decision he had not yet fully accepted. The pauses grew longer. The detours became stranger. The hours he spent sitting motionless in his car were the first undeniable sign that he was not simply lost. He was drifting into an emotional and psychological fog, impossible to interpret. As night merged with early morning, Bryce positioned himself at rest stops, gas stations, and empty roadside shoulders, repeating the same pattern. Stopping, waiting, staring forward into the dark, as if the answer he sought lay somewhere on the horizon. Each stop pointed to a mind locked in internal conflict, perhaps trapped between fear and resolve. The landscape around him grew increasingly isolated. The lights of the city receded, replaced by the faint silhouettes of rural hills and the hum of distant traffic. The quiet around him thickened until it resembled a physical presence. Something heavy, still, and oppressive. Hours passed in this liminal state, each minute stretching unnaturally long, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate whatever battle was unfolding inside him. Phone records later revealed gaps that felt unsettling. Periods where he should have been reachable, where signals should have aligned, No activity occurred. These silences formed the most disturbing part of the timeline, as if Bryce had briefly slipped out of the digital world entirely. Then came the final stretch of the journey, the part that still haunts investigators and family members. Bryce approached the rugged region near Castaic, a landscape of steep drops, uneven terrain, and remote access points where help is rare and night seems deeper than anywhere else in California. The area around Castaic is not a place where people casually stop. It is not a place that invites late-night reflection. Yet Bryce arrived there after hours of driving and stopped again. Not for minutes, but for long, unaccounted stretches of time. The environment around him was silent, devoid of traffic, lit only by the faint glow of distant lamps and the reflection of moonlight on the water below. The jagged hills formed shadows that stretched across the road like darkened hands. Anyone passing through would have continued quickly, but Bryce lingered. He remained in that place as though bound to it, as though its quiet austerity matched whatever was happening inside him. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds. His car surged forward down a service road leading toward an embankment overlooking Castaic Lake. Tire tracks later showed a deliberate acceleration, not a skid or loss of control. The vehicle plunged off the steep drop, crashed through brush, rolled violently, and came to rest on its side near the water's edge. It was the kind of crash that leaves behind a scene of chaos: shattered glass, torn metal, displaced earth. Yet what investigators found inside the wreckage was more haunting than the crash itself. The car was empty, the seatbelt unfastened, the driver's side door open. No blood, no signs of severe injury, no indication that Bryce had been unable to walk away. His wallet remained, his clothes remained, his phone remained. Everything remained except Bryce. The footprints that should have been there were not. The trail that should have followed from the crash site simply didn't exist. It was as if he had stepped out of the broken vehicle and dissolved into the silence around him, swallowed by the darkness or spirited into the unseen spaces between terrain and night. Search teams mobilized within hours. Drones scanned the hillsides. Dogs traced faint scents that vanished abruptly. Divers searched the lake. Deputies combed the ravines, but the land refused to yield any trace of him. The crash site, though violent, offered no clues. The terrain, though unforgiving, offered no explanation. And the timeline, though meticulously reconstructed, revealed no path forward. By sunrise, Bryce Laspisa had become not a missing person, but an unanswered equation. A young man who entered the night with all his belongings intact, stepped out of a wrecked car, and vanished so completely that even the landscape could not remember him. Investigators tried to map his final movements, but the data defied pattern. They tried to understand his mental state, but the signals were contradictory. They tried to determine whether he was running from fear, confusion, impulse, or something more intangible. But every theory fractured under scrutiny. The disappearance had no witnesses, no camera footage, no final message, and no physical evidence beyond an empty car, pointed toward a lake that held no body. By the end of the first 24 hours, one conclusion remained impossible to dismiss. Bryce had not simply gone missing. He had driven into nowhere, and whatever awaited him in that darkness did not leave him behind. The search for Bryce began not as a coordinated mission, but as a desperate scramble fueled by confusion, disbelief, and a growing sense that something was deeply wrong. The crash site was examined repeatedly. Each pass through the dry brush and uneven dirt, exposing only the same haunting truth. The car remained, but the young man who drove it had evaporated into the landscape. There were no imprints in the soil that suggested purposeful movement, no drag marks that hinted at injury, no discarded belongings that pointed toward a direction. The Nissan lay tilted on its side like a gutted shell, as if its occupant had slipped out of existence rather than stepped into the world beyond it. From the first daylight hour, the terrain became both ally and adversary. Deputies traced every path that should have led away from the embankment, only to be confronted with contradictions. Search dogs picked up faint traces, but the scents dissipated almost instantly, as if Bryce had moved through the space without leaving a biological footprint. Helicopters scanned the ridges, drones mapped the ravines, divers sank into the cold, dark depths of the lake near the crash. Yet none of these efforts produced evidence substantial enough to suggest a plausible theory. Investigators dissected the final 24 hours of his life with forensic precision, hoping that any inconsistency might form a pattern. They reconstructed the stops he made, the long hours he spent idling in unfamiliar places, the inexplicable detours across the state, the restlessness that hinted at an internal battle. But each layer of analysis only deepened the mystery. Bryce's journey formed a trajectory that resembled neither panic nor clarity. It was something in between, something disquietingly deliberate, as though he was transitioning from one state of mind to another, leaving no verbal record of what his thoughts were during those long, silent hours. Family and friends were interviewed, and the timeline of his behavioral shift became clearer but no less disturbing. Before leaving his apartment, he had given away valued possessions as though detaching himself from material anchors. He had remained awake through nights, consumed stimulants, and withdrawn emotionally from the people who cared for him. Yet none of these actions pointed definitively toward self-destruction or escape. They suggested instead an undefined transition, a psychological liminality where even he might not have understood his own motivations. Search coordinators widened the radius repeatedly, pushing into terrain where the landscape grew harsher and more unforgiving. Each expansion of the perimeter felt less like chasing a missing person and more like confronting an invisible force that absorbed every clue. Tracks that should have been preserved by morning dew were absent. Areas where footprints should have lingered turned up blank. Environmental experts suggested that the ground might have hardened quickly, erasing impressions before they could settle. Others believed the soil, composed of shifting granules and uneven rock, simply couldn't retain prints. But these explanations felt shallow in the shadow of a disappearance so complete it bordered on unreal. The psychological profile of Bryce became the focal point, as physical evidence remained elusive. Specialists examined his recent behavior, noting the subtle signals of detachment, dissociation, and possible cognitive fragmentation. But none could determine whether he was fleeing something internal or responding to something external. The absence of clear indicators made the case feel suspended in an interpretive void, where every theory sounded plausible, yet none could be proven. The crash itself posed the most unsettling question. Why accelerate toward a slope that guaranteed impact, but not necessarily death? The angle of descent suggested intention, yet the aftermath revealed no injury severe enough to hinder mobility. No blood was found inside or outside the vehicle. The seatbelt was unlatched, suggesting purposeful exit rather than ejection. And the absence of footprints indicated either that he had left quickly, in a manner that defied typical movement, or that environmental factors erased his trail in an impossibly short time. As the hours turned into days and days into weeks, the search effort shifted from proactive to reflective. The area was combed repeatedly, each pass yielding the same eerie silence. The lake was scanned so thoroughly that divers could navigate its contours from memory. Yet no trace of Bryce's body emerged. Experts argued that if he had entered the water, his body would have surfaced eventually. But it never did. The possibility of voluntary disappearance was explored, but soon dismissed. Bryce had left behind his wallet, identification, clothes, and phone. Items essential for anyone intending to start a new life. There were no withdrawals from his accounts, no sightings that matched his description, no digital activity that hinted at survival beyond the moment he stepped out of the wreck. Voluntary disappearance required planning. Bryce's timeline revealed turbulence, but not strategy. Psychological collapse became another theory. Perhaps he had wandered into the hills in a dissociative state and succumbed to the elements. But thorough searches of all accessible terrain contradicted this idea. Human remains, even in harsh conditions, eventually surface, or are found by wildlife, hunters, or hikers. The region around Castaic was not empty land. People passed through regularly enough that a body could not remain hidden indefinitely. And yet, Bryce's did. Equally haunting was the possibility that he had been injured internally, concealed from external inspection, and wandered until disorientation overcame him. But again, the absence of a body challenged that conclusion. Rescue teams had covered the region with a level of detail usually reserved for aviation disasters, mapping every gully, ravine, and clearing where a person might collapse. The final theory, that Bryce encountered another person or group that night, was the most complex and the least provable. The area around Castaic included remote access points and isolated structures, places where an individual could encounter danger unseen. But there were no signs of struggle, no evidence of tracks other than the tire marks leading over the slope. If another party had been involved, they had left no physical trace, no digital footprint, no identifiable evidence that could anchor the theory in fact. In the months that followed, the case slid slowly from active investigation into the realm of unresolved anomaly. The wrecked car remained the central artifact of the last night he was known to be alive. A silent monument to a disappearance that resisted all interpretation. The landscape surrounding it became an emblem of unanswered questions. A place where searchers walked in the footprints of a young man who left none behind. His family clung to hope, refusing to accept the possibility that Bryce had vanished permanently. They organized independent searches, speaking with hikers, tracking new leads, clinging to any fragment of information that might break the silence. Each new effort ended the same way. With a return to the crash site, the realization that nothing had changed, and the crushing weight of uncertainty settling over everything once again. In time, the case entered cultural memory, becoming one of California's most baffling modern disappearances. Online communities dissected the timeline, proposing theories that ranged from psychological collapse to orchestrated abduction to phenomena that defied conventional logic. Each explanation tried to fill the void left by Bryce's absence, but the truth remained inaccessible. Locked somewhere between the last moments of his drive and the vast, silent darkness that swallowed him. Years passed, yet the land around Castaic Lake continued to hold its secrets. No bones surfaced, no hikers stumbled upon remains, no clues emerged during droughts that receded the waterline. Nothing, absolutely nothing, appeared to interrupt the completeness of Bryce's disappearance. And so the narrative became not just the story of a young man who vanished, but of a night that refused to yield clarity. A night that seemed to absorb him entirely, leaving behind only questions suspended in the air above a ravine. A night where the world kept moving, the earth remained still, and a single red car lay overturned at the bottom of a slope. Its driver gone, its path forward erased, its final chapter unwritten. Bryce Laspisa drove into nowhere, and nowhere never gave him back.